Welcome back to the Enlightenment Now series, where we're looking at Steven Pinker's book on how much progress humanity has made over the past 250 years. In the previous episode, we looked at global wealth and how it's literally exploded since the Industrial Revolution, which at first created a stark divide between the developed and the developing world, but over the past 50 years, the rest of the world has caught up, in particular China and other Asian nations. And so we now have a situation where 200 years ago, 90% of people lived in extreme poverty, and today 10% do. So this is a huge change. But we can still ask, have the gains of all this productivity and innovation been distributed fairly? What do we do about the vast levels of inequality between rich and poor in the world? And Steven Pinker in this chapter gives us 3 reasons not to necessarily worry so much about inequality. And we're going to look at those 3 reasons in turn, and I'm going to say that even if they're true, we still have plenty of reason to worry about inequality and do something about it. Okay, so the first reason that Pinker gives us to not care so much about inequality is that it's not actually inequality that we care about per se. He says what we care about is poverty reduction. So if we have 2 people who are doing pretty well off, one doing slightly better than the other, we wouldn't want to reduce the income of the person who's doing slightly better just so that they become level again with the person who's doing slightly worse. We really care about a situation where there are many people doing badly and there are a few people doing very well, so there clearly are routes potentially out of poverty, but they're not being taken. So with this, Pinker goes, okay, well, if what we care about is poverty reduction, the best thing we've seen to get rid of poverty is economic growth. It's making the pie bigger rather than distributing the pie differently. So he says that, you know, we prefer to live, or we should prefer to live in a dynamic, productive world, which there is inequality in, rather than a stagnant, languishing world that is more equal. So that's the first reason, according to Pinker, that we don't necessarily need to worry about inequality per se. The second reason Pinker gives as to why inequality isn't necessarily so much of a problem is that inequality, rather than not necessarily being bad in itself, can actually be good insofar as it is fair. It's fairness that people ultimately care about. He shows a study where people are actually happier in unequal yet fairly unequal countries, that is countries that have good education and other upward means of social mobility in comparison to countries that are more equal yet don't necessarily have those things. So what people care about in essentially is hope. People don't mind there being inequality if it's a sign that things are moving forward, if it's a sign that there is plenty of productivity and innovation going on. Because always when there is productivity and innovation, those gains will initially be received unequally, because that's how these gains are initially shared. The question is, do we feel we have access to this productivity and innovation that's happening? We shouldn't shy away from these unequal distributions if there's enough fairness going around that we also benefit from them. The third reason Pinker gives to square the levels of inequality we currently have with his kind of agenda for economic growth is the findings that make up Wagner's law. Now this is the finding that as countries get richer, they tend to invest more in social spending. The most obvious example of this is the rise of the welfare state after World War II, where with great levels of economic prosperity, governments didn't just care about sort of warring and policing, they also cared about nurturing their citizens. And we can see this still going on today. So Indonesia, for example, a relatively poor country, currently redistributes 2% of its GDP, whereas a country like the US, which is much richer, redistributes 19% of its GDP into various social services. Now, of course, other countries invest even more than the US, Scandinavian countries, France, for example. Pinker generally thinks there's a sort of sweet spot where after about 25% of GDP being invested in social services, that no longer becomes as an effective means of increasing prosperity. Either way, it's a convenient and important finding for squaring economic growth with inequality, this idea of Wagner's law that as a country gets richer, not only does the pie get bigger, but it also becomes more fairly distributed. Everyone gets richer eventually. So that's the final reason Pinker gives for why inequality isn't necessarily such a bad thing, or certainly in the long run. What I want to say next is that, well, we still have plenty of reasons to worry about inequality, even if what Pinker says is true. So the first reason we should worry about inequality is the reverse of what Pinker says. So Pinker says, look, inequality isn't necessarily bad in itself. What we care about is reducing poverty, and the best way to do that is through economic growth. And I think he's right that economic growth really does chip away steadily at inequality in the long run. But it doesn't necessarily reduce poverty as much as we can and as quickly as possible. So an example of this, in his book The Divide, Jason Hickel shows how at our current rate of economic growth, it will take roughly 100 years to end global poverty. Whereas he states a variety of redistributive means in which we can end global poverty much more quickly. Things like changing laws in terms of wages, in terms of debt, in terms of trade. Again, changing how we distribute the pie is potentially a much more effective means than simply steadily increasing it over time and not worrying about who gains from that. The second reason why I think we still need to worry about inequality is, again, the reverse of Pinker's second reason why we shouldn't. So Pinker says that as long as the levels of inequality are fair, people are happy with it. Well, the question is, are they fair? And I think there's certain examples where they're clearly not. So if you look, for example, in the US, where people are encouraged to believe in the American dream, the statistics on social mobility are shocking. So if you're born into the bottom fifth of households in the overall income distribution, you have only a 36% chance of staying there, and only 10% chance of making it to the top fifth. And things are much worse if you're a black American born into the bottom fifth. You have a 51% chance of staying at the bottom, or only a 3% chance of making it to the top. Picture is similar for unmarried parents and high school dropouts. That doesn't seem like the kind of fair game to me. It seems more like the rules of the game are rigged from the start. The third reason why I think we need to worry about inequality is, again, turning what Pinker says on his head in terms of Wagner's law. This is the finding that as countries get richer, they tend to spend more of their GDP on social services. Now, presumably, countries do this because they can afford to. It gets to the stage where a country is so prosperous that it's simply not fair for all those gains to be held by the rich when they could be more fairly distributed. Now, for Pinker, he thinks that there's this kind of 25% mark where a country should invest that level of their GDP in terms of social services, and it becomes inefficient afterwards. But that clearly isn't straightforward when you have countries like the US that currently invest just under 20% of their GDP, when countries like France, who invest over 30% of their GDP. So there's clearly leeway here, and it's not obvious that we should rest content with the idea that we currently distribute things in the right way. If anything, increasing economic growth, increasing prosperity means that we should constantly be thinking about how we can distribute that more fairly. These three reasons why we should worry about inequality lead us to what I think is the fundamental issue with Pinker's analysis of global wealth and how it's distributed. Pinker highlights that inequality can be viewed as good or bad, depending on whether it's seen as fair, but gives very little analysis of what is in fact fair. He seems to think that how things are fair, and that there's a happy coincidence that the more and more prosperity we have, the richer and richer we get, we will tend to make things fairer over time. But can't we do better than that? So as an example, Pinker looks at how over the past 50 years in developed countries, inequality has actually increased. So many political theorists blame this on the neoliberal policies of the Reagan and Thatcher institutions in the 1980s, where the size of the welfare state has been substantially cut, despite the fact that we've had continued economic growth, despite the fact that the pie has been getting bigger. Now, Pinker says this isn't necessarily a result of politics, as it is an inevitable trade-off of globalization. So certainly in the US, for example, we've seen this hollowing out of the lower middle class as emerging countries such as China and other Asian nations have taken over various technological and manufacturing industries. We have an emerging global middle class that is effectively taking or distributing wealth away from the lower middle class in rich countries. The lower middle class of the rich world are the losers of globalization, those who have been left behind. Now, this is all very well, but Pinker seems to accept this trade-off without any further justification. Even if it's the case that globalization helped the lower middle classes of poor countries much more than it helped the lower middle classes of rich countries, should we just accept that and do nothing about it? It seems more obvious to me that if this is an inevitable trade-off of globalization, rich countries should be investing more into helping those losers from this dynamic. We're seeing currently an opioid crisis and deaths of despair in the US, and that's something that shouldn't be acceptable if we can see this sort of thing coming. Why Pinker seems to think that this is fair levels of inequality just because millions, if not billions of people around the globe are benefiting from it, seems to miss the point for all those who are doing worse. So it's this idea of fairness that I think we return to over and over again in Pinker's analysis. We can accept that what we care about is reducing poverty, but we can at the same time ask, can we do more? Can we do better for those who are still impoverished or for those who are getting worse off? And that's something that I think Pinker doesn't do enough.